What if I told you that a single decision made by a 9-year-old girl on a snowy February morning would lead to one of the most chilling discoveries in criminal history, 30 years later? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. Picture this. You're waiting at your usual bus stop, the cold seeping through your winter coat, when an unfamiliar yellow school bus rolls up. The driver doesn't look quite right, but you're just a kid trying to get to school. Has this ever happened to you? That moment of uncertainty when something feels off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? For most of us, these moments pass without consequence. But for Sophie Martinez, that single moment would change everything. In the winter of 1994, the small town of Maple Ridge, Ohio was experiencing chaos. A citywide bus driver strike had left thousands of students scrambling for alternate transportation to school. Parents were juggling work schedules, carpools were hastily arranged, and substitute drivers were brought in to fill the gaps. It was the perfect storm of confusion and desperation, exactly the kind of environment where predators thrive undetected. 9-year-old Sophie Martinez stood on the corner of Maple Avenue and Pine Street that February morning, her purple knit hat pulled tight against the bitter cold. Her mother, Carol, was already at the factory pulling another double shift, trying to make ends meet. Sophie didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to add to her mother's stress. So she waited, just like she always did for her regular bus to arrive. But the bus that came that morning wasn't regular at all. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. This story doesn't end with a typical missing child case. 30 years later, on February 3, 2024, workers operating heavy machinery during a routine logging operation in Maple Ridge made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the entire community. As their steel-toothed excavator clawed through the frozen earth, they heard an unexpected sound, the shuddering clang of metal against metal. What emerged from that frozen ground was something no one could have anticipated. The buried roof of an old yellow school bus, its windows black with age, its frame twisted and crushed as if something heavy had been deliberately dropped on top of it decades ago. But the real mystery wasn't the bus itself. It was what investigators found inside when they carefully excavated the vehicle. In the driver's seat sat the mummified remains of an adult male, still wearing a green driver's uniform, his skeletal hands still gripping the steering wheel as if frozen in his final moment. But perhaps even more haunting was what they discovered on the third row, left-hand side. A small red lunchbox, perfectly preserved, with a faded piece of masking tape still clinging to its surface. Written in a child's careful handwriting were the words that would crack open a cold case that had haunted Maple Ridge for 3 decades. Sophie Martinez, Room 4A. The question that immediately gripped investigators was chilling in its simplicity. If Sophie's lunchbox was in that buried bus with a dead driver, where was Sophie? And perhaps more terrifyingly, who was the man behind the wheel? And why had this makeshift tomb remained hidden beneath the Ohio soil for 30 long years? What happened next would unravel a web of deception so intricate and disturbing that it would challenge everything law enforcement thought they knew about missing children cases, and reveal a truth far more sinister than anyone in Maple Ridge could have imagined. The human mind is fascinating in how it processes danger signals, isn't it? We often talk about gut instincts and that little voice warning us when something isn't right. But what happens when you're just 9 years old, standing in the cold, and your entire framework for understanding the world tells you that adults in uniforms are there to help you? This is the hidden truth about predators. They understand exactly how to exploit our most basic assumptions about safety and authority. When that yellow bus with fogged windows finally rounded the corner onto Maple Avenue, Sophie felt something shift in her stomach. The vehicle moved differently than her regular bus. Slower, more deliberate, like it was searching rather than following a familiar route. Behind the wheel sat a man she'd never seen before, wearing a dark green jacket instead of the standard school-issued windbreaker that every district driver wore. He had a neatly trimmed beard and glasses, but there was something unsettling about the way he avoided making eye contact, staring straight ahead as the bus doors hissed open. The transformation from a normal school morning to something sinister happened in that exact moment of hesitation. Sophie stood there, her breath visible in the cold air, weighing her options. Walk the dangerous mile to school across icy overpasses, or trust this stranger who claimed to be covering her route. The decision-making process of a child is so different from an adult's. They're wired to trust authority figures, to follow rules, to not make waves. The predator was counting on exactly this mindset. As Sophie climbed aboard, she immediately sensed the atmosphere was wrong. The bus was dimly lit, filled with an unnatural silence that seemed to absorb sound. The other students scattered throughout the seats were kids she didn't recognize. Some older, some younger, but all sharing the same eerie quietness. No chatter, no laughter, no typical school bus chaos. It was as if they'd all been instructed to remain silent, creating an environment that felt more like a controlled experiment than transportation to school. The heating system hummed with an intensity that made the air thick and drowsy. Sophie found a seat halfway back, clutching her red lunchbox on her lap, and watched through the fogged window as familiar landmarks slowly disappeared. Something fundamental was shifting in her world, though she couldn't yet comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The bus wasn't heading toward Northbriar Elementary. It was heading somewhere else entirely. Meanwhile, Carol Martinez was deep into another exhausting shift at the packaging plant, unaware that her daughter's entire future was being rewritten in real time. The impact of that morning's events wouldn't become clear until much later, when the usual rhythms of their daily routine failed to align. It's a reminder of how quickly life can change direction, how a single moment can create a before and after that reshapes everything. When Carol finally returned home that evening, her mother's intuition immediately detected something amiss. Sophie's boots weren't in their usual spot by the door. Her backpack wasn't thrown carelessly in the hallway. The house felt different, empty in a way that goes beyond physical absence. By 7:02 p.m., she was dialing the police, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she tried to explain that her daughter hadn't come home. Officer Ryan Thompson's investigation of Sophie's bedroom that night revealed something that would haunt him for years to come. Everything was exactly as a 9-year-old would leave it. Homework completed and placed neatly on her desk, bed still holding the shape of her small body from the night before, clothes laid out for the next day. There were no signs of planning, no indication of a runaway. This was a child who had every intention of returning home, whose entire world revolved around the simple routines of childhood. The transformation of a missing child case from active investigation to cold case is a journey that most people never witness behind the scenes. Within days of Sophie's disappearance, Maple Ridge became a town covered in paper faces. Missing person flyers appeared on every telephone pole, store window, and community bulletin board. The image showed a smiling 9-year-old with brown hair and green eyes, wearing that purple knit hat her grandmother had lovingly crocheted just months before. The details were heartbreakingly specific. Height, 4 feet 7 inches, weight 72 pounds, last seen wearing gray snow pants and a black coat with pink lining. But here's where the story takes a disturbing turn that reveals the hidden truth about how easily our systems can fail us. When investigators tried to piece together the events of that February morning, they discovered something that should have sent immediate alarm bells ringing. The substitute bus logs for that day were catastrophically incomplete. Most routes had detailed documentation, driver signatures, student counts, and return times. But Route 15X told a different story entirely. The entry was sparse, almost deliberately vague. 5 students picked up, 0 dropped off. No driver name, no return time, no explanation for the discrepancy. Think about the mindset required to create such a record. This wasn't administrative negligence. This was calculated deception. Someone had planned this entire operation knowing exactly how to exploit the chaos of the strike. They understood that in the confusion of substitute drivers and emergency transportation arrangements, a few missing signatures and incomplete paperwork would go unnoticed until it was far too late. The impact of that single morning rippled through the community in ways that went far beyond Sophie's immediate family. Parents began walking their children to school, Neighbors organized carpools with military precision, and the simple act of waiting for a bus became loaded with anxiety. The collective mindset of an entire town shifted from trust to vigilance overnight, but even that heightened awareness couldn't bring Sophie home. If this investigation resonated with you the way it did with me while putting it together, hitting that like button really helps other people discover these important stories that deserve to be told. What followed was 3 decades of the most profound kind of silence, not just the absence of answers, but the gradual fading of hope itself. Sophie's lunchbox was never found discarded in a ditch. Her boots never turned up in a thrift store. That distinctive purple hat, stitched with love by arthritic fingers, never appeared in lost and found boxes or evidence lockers. It was as if she had been erased from existence so completely that even the physical traces of her presence that morning had been systematically eliminated. The revelations that emerged during those 30 years paint a picture of a community grappling with the impossible. Theories circulated like seasonal weather patterns, runaway scenarios during the spring months when hope felt renewable, kidnapping theories that dominated the harsh winters when despair settled in like snow. Some suggested accidents, others pointed to family dysfunction, but every lead dissolved under scrutiny. Carol Martinez endured decades of whispered accusations and sympathetic glances, her grief becoming a public spectacle that the town both embraced and quietly resented. Behind the scenes, the case file grew thin, while other investigations demanded attention. Detectives retired, evidence storage protocols changed, and technological advances promised new possibilities that never materialized into actual breakthroughs. The transformation from active case to cold case to forgotten case happened so gradually that no one could pinpoint exactly when hope officially died. The moment Sheriff Maria Gonzalez received that call on February 3, 2024, she knew her department was about to face something unprecedented. 30 years of law enforcement experience had taught her to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited at that excavation site on County Road 22. The transformation of a routine logging operation into the most significant crime scene discovery in Maple Ridge history happened in the span of a single phone call. Picture the scene. Heavy machinery designed to clear dead trees suddenly grinding to a halt as the operator's steel-toothed excavator strikes something that shouldn't exist beneath the frozen earth. The sound itself was wrong. Metal against metal in a place where only soil and roots should have been. The mindset shift from routine work to potential evidence preservation had to happen immediately, and, fortunately, the crew leader understood the gravity of what they might have uncovered. When Sheriff Gonzalez arrived at the site, she was confronted with a sight that defied logical explanation. What emerged from the dirt was unmistakably the roof and upper portion of a yellow school bus, but its condition told a story of deliberate concealment rather than accidental burial. The vehicle's back end had been crushed inward with the kind of force that suggested something heavy had been deliberately dropped on it, almost as if someone wanted to ensure it would never accidentally surface on its own. The windows were black with decades of accumulated grime and moisture, some completely shattered, others spiderwebbed with cracks that spoke to the violent impact that had ended this bus's journey. The revelation that this wasn't some abandoned vehicle dumped carelessly, but rather a carefully hidden crime scene, began to reshape everything investigators thought they knew about Sophie Martinez's disappearance. The decision to proceed with full crime scene protocols transformed the excavation site into something resembling an archaeological dig. Medical examiner teams worked with painstaking precision to preserve whatever evidence might have survived 3 decades underground. The impact of their first glimpse inside that buried bus would haunt every investigator present for years to come. What they discovered behind the scenes of this makeshift tomb was a tableau of horror frozen in time. In the driver's seat sat the mummified remains of an adult male, still wearing that same dark green jacket that Sophie had noticed 30 years earlier. His skeletal frame was slumped sideways, but his hands remained positioned on the steering wheel as if death had taken him while still attempting to drive. The preservation was remarkable and disturbing. The dry conditions inside the buried bus had essentially mummified the remains, creating a perfect snapshot of that final moment. But the most chilling discovery was waiting on the third row, left side. Sophie's red lunchbox sat exactly where she had placed it that February morning in 1994, still zipped shut, as if time itself had been suspended inside this underground tomb. The hidden truth contained within that small plastic container would prove to be more revealing than any witness testimony. Or surveillance footage could have been. If you're someone who appreciates when true crime goes deeper than just the headlines, when we take time to understand the full human story behind these cases, I'd love to have you subscribe and join this community of thoughtful viewers. When investigators carefully opened the lunchbox, they found the mundane details of a 9-year-old school day perfectly preserved, a bruised apple that had long since mummified, a juice box still bearing the colorful cartoon characters that were popular in the mid-90s, and, most significantly, a permission slip dated February 7, 1994, 3 days after Sophie's disappearance. This single piece of paper would transform the entire understanding of the case, because it meant Sophie had been alive, had been planning for future school activities, had been existing somewhere for at least 72 hours after she vanished. The transformation of evidence analysis from hopeful to horrifying happened the moment investigators began examining the bus itself more closely. You see, every vehicle tells a story through its identifying markers, license plates, vehicle identification numbers, registration stickers, but this school bus had been systematically stripped of its identity. The license plates were completely absent, not lost or damaged, but deliberately removed. The VIN had been filed down with precision tools and then partially torched, creating a deliberate destruction of identity that spoke to a level of criminal sophistication that chilled investigators to the bone. This wasn't the work of an opportunistic predator acting on impulse. The mindset required to systematically erase a vehicle's identity suggests someone who understood exactly how law enforcement would investigate, someone who had planned not just the abduction, but the complete elimination of evidence. The hidden truth emerging from this discovery was that they were dealing with a criminal who had thought several moves ahead, like a chess master anticipating every possible counterstrike. Sheriff Gonzalez's decision to review the original case files would prove to be the key that unlocked 30 years of carefully buried secrets. The journey back through decades of paperwork and evidence boxes revealed a pattern of deception that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Detective Mark Sullivan, a 20-year veteran who had joined the force well after Sophie's disappearance, approached case file number 940185 with fresh eyes unburdened by the emotional weight that had clouded earlier investigations. What he discovered behind the scenes of that February 1994 morning was a masterclass in exploiting systemic chaos. The substitute driver logs told a story that no one had fully appreciated at the time. While most routes had detailed documentation with driver signatures, vehicle assignments, and student counts, Route 15X stood out like a glaring anomaly. The entry was almost mockingly simple. Time: out 7:43 a.m., students 5, did not return to depot, driver not identified. The impact of this revelation was staggering. Someone had walked into the transportation depot during the height of the strike chaos, selected a bus, and simply driven away without anyone questioning their authority. They had exploited the perfect storm of confusion, understaffing, and emergency protocols to essentially steal a school bus in broad daylight. The transformation from legitimate transportation to kidnapping vehicle had happened within the normal operations of the school district itself. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. Detective Sullivan's investigation revealed that this wasn't just about taking advantage of a convenient opportunity. The timing was too precise. The execution too smooth. This person had been studying the system, understanding its vulnerabilities, waiting for exactly the right moment when chaos would provide the perfect cover for their operation. The mindset required for this level of patient planning suggests someone who had been watching, learning, preparing for months or even years. The revelations continued to mount as Sullivan dug deeper into the transportation records. The bus that had been buried for 30 years wasn't supposed to exist in active service that day. It had been scheduled for maintenance, was supposed to be sitting in the depot lot, but somehow had been pressed into service for Route 15X. Someone with inside knowledge of the district's operations had specifically selected a vehicle that wouldn't be immediately missed, wouldn't trigger automatic tracking protocols, wouldn't set off alarm bells until it was far too late. The decisions made that morning weren't random or impulsive. They were part of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been designed to exploit every weakness in the system. From the timing of the strike to the selection of the specific bus to the manipulation of the paperwork, every element had been calculated to provide maximum confusion and minimum traceability. The journey from skeletal remains to concrete answers required the expertise of someone who could read stories written in bone and decay. Dr. Patricia Chen had spent 3 decades analyzing human remains at the Madison State Lab, but the skeleton retrieved from that buried school bus presented a particularly haunting puzzle. The transformation of flesh to bone tells its own narrative, and what emerged from her forensic analysis painted a picture that was both revealing and deeply disturbing. The remains belonged to a Caucasian male, approximately 45 to 55 years old at the time of death, standing between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 11 inches tall. But it was the evidence of trauma that truly captured Dr. Chen's attention. The suspected head injury wasn't consistent with the kind of damage you'd expect from a vehicle accident or natural death. This was blunt force trauma, deliberate and fatal, suggesting that whoever this man was, his involvement in Sophie's disappearance had ended violently. The mindset required to kill someone and then bury them along with the evidence reveals a level of cold calculation that goes beyond typical criminal behavior. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of panic. This was systematic elimination of a potential witness. The hidden truth emerging from this discovery was that the person orchestrating Sophie's abduction had been willing to commit murder to protect their operation, which meant they had far more to lose than anyone had initially understood. But the most intriguing piece of evidence found with the remains was also the smallest, a single brass locker key marked H18, clutched in what remained of the driver's jacket pocket. The impact of this seemingly insignificant detail would prove to be enormous, because this key didn't match any school-issued locks or district storage systems. It was completely outside the educational framework, pointing to a whole other layer of this operation that investigators had never considered. The revelations that followed Detective Sullivan's investigation of that key would transform the entire case from a simple abduction to something far more sinister. The key led to a condemned storage facility in Riverside, Ohio, about 80 miles from Maple Ridge. Unit H18 had been rented under the fake name Tommy Lee Davis and paid for exclusively in cash, another indication of the methodical planning that characterized every aspect of this operation. When investigators finally gained access to that storage unit, they discovered what can only be described as a shrine to obsession. Behind the scenes of what appeared to be a routine storage space was a carefully curated collection of evidence that revealed the true scope of this criminal enterprise. A deteriorated mattress suggested someone had been held there. VHS tapes organized in milk crates hinted at documentation of whatever had taken place, and newspaper clippings about Sophie's disappearance showed the perpetrator had been following the investigation closely. A like on this video means more than just engagement numbers to me. It tells me that stories like Sophie's, told with care and respect, are reaching people who understand why these cases matter. But the most chilling discovery was a child's coat, gray with pink lining, exactly matching the description of what Sophie had been wearing that February morning. The decisions made in preserving this evidence weren't sentimental. They were calculated. This person had kept trophies, documentation, proof of their success in a way that suggested they were either planning to revisit these moments or possibly use them for some other purpose entirely. The photograph they found tucked between the newspaper clippings stopped everyone cold. It showed Sophie standing beside the yellow school bus, smiling slightly with that trusting expression that only children possess. But what made this image truly disturbing wasn't just its existence. It was the fact that someone had taken the time to document this moment, to create a permanent record of the exact instant when an innocent child's life was about to be forever changed. The journey through that storage unit revealed a mind that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, someone who could commit horrific acts while maintaining the organizational skills of a meticulous record keeper. The transformation from predator to documenter to killer painted a picture of someone far more dangerous and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The transformation from missing child case to documented systematic abuse became undeniably clear when investigators examined that glossy photograph more closely. The image quality was professional, printed on high-grade photo paper that spoke to someone who took documentation seriously. Sophie stood in front of the yellow school bus, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and trust, while the bearded man's hand rested on her shoulder with a possessiveness that made everyone who viewed it feel physically ill. But the background of that photograph told an even more disturbing story. Behind Sophie and her captor stretched thick evergreens and an unpaved clearing that screamed isolation and careful planning. This wasn't a random location or crime of opportunity. This was a deliberately chosen site, remote enough to ensure no witnesses, no accidental discoveries, no possibility of rescue. The mindset required to scout and prepare such a location reveals someone who had been planning this operation for far longer than anyone had imagined. The caption, written in black marker across the bottom of the photograph, stopped investigators cold. Day 1. She's perfect. Those 4 words encapsulated a level of premeditation and psychological detachment that forensic psychologists struggle to comprehend. The hidden truth embedded in that simple phrase was that Sophie's abduction wasn't the end goal. It was just the beginning of something far more sinister and systematic. The revelations continued to mount when investigators discovered the cracked plastic box hidden beneath the deteriorated mattress. Inside were 4 cassette tapes, each meticulously labeled in the same precise handwriting: S1, S2, S3, S4. The decision to document whatever had happened to Sophie wasn't driven by nostalgia or sentiment. This was clinical record-keeping, the kind of systematic documentation that suggests either research purposes or preparation for replication. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the spiral notebook titled Sleep Schedule, found alongside the tapes. The journey through its pages revealed a mind that approached child abuse with the detachment of a scientific researcher. Page after page contained clinical observations of Sophie's daily routines, meal preferences, sleep patterns, and what could only be described as behavioral conditioning protocols. The impact of reading these entries was devastating for investigators who realized they were looking at evidence of systematic psychological manipulation spanning weeks or possibly months. The notebook entries read like laboratory notes documenting an experiment in human behavior modification. Every detail of Sophie's existence had been monitored, recorded, and analyzed. Her reactions to different foods, her responses to various stimuli, her adaptation to captivity, all of it meticulously documented with the cold precision of someone conducting research rather than someone emotionally invested in a victim's well-being. Behind the scenes of what appeared to be a simple kidnapping case was emerging evidence of something far more sophisticated and terrifying. The transformation from random predator to systematic researcher suggested someone with either professional training in behavioral psychology or extensive self-education in techniques of control and manipulation. The decisions recorded in that notebook weren't impulsive acts of violence. They were calculated steps in a process designed to completely reshape a child's understanding of reality. The handwriting analysis would later reveal that these notes had been taken over an extended period, with subtle changes in pen ink and writing pressure suggesting weeks of continuous observation. The mindset required to maintain such detailed documentation, while simultaneously holding a child captive, reveals a level of compartmentalization that speaks to either professional training or significant experience in this type of criminal activity. The implications were staggering. If Sophie's captor had been this methodical, this clinical in his approach, then everything about her disappearance needed to be reevaluated. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was a sophisticated operation that had been planned, executed, and documented with scientific precision. The moment investigators made the decision to play those cassette tapes in a controlled environment, they crossed a threshold that forever changed everyone involved in the case. There's something uniquely haunting about hearing a child's voice preserved in time, especially when that voice carries the weight of systematic psychological manipulation. The transformation from missing person case to documented evidence of long-term captivity became undeniably real when Sophie's 9-year-old voice filled that sterile examination room. The first tape began with static, then a man's voice, calm and measured. "Okay, sweetheart, say your name for me." After a pause that seemed to last forever, a small, uncertain voice responded, "Sophie." The man's tone remained patient but firm. Louder. "Sophie Martinez," came the clearer response, then the chilling instruction that revealed the true scope of this operation. "Good girl, now say it the way I taught you." Without hesitation, the child's voice replied, "Sophie Davis." The impact of those 4 simple words cannot be overstated. Behind the scenes of what appeared to be a straightforward kidnapping was evidence of systematic identity reconstruction. The mindset required to methodically erase a child's sense of self, to replace their fundamental understanding of who they are, speaks to a level of psychological sophistication that most people cannot comprehend. This wasn't just about taking Sophie away from her family. This was about transforming her into someone else entirely. The revelations continued as investigators worked through the remaining tapes, each one documenting a different stage in Sophie's psychological conditioning. The journey from terrified victim to compliant participant was captured in heartbreaking detail, showing how a skilled manipulator could gradually reshape a child's reality through a combination of isolation, routine, and carefully calibrated rewards and punishments. The hidden truth embedded in these recordings was that Sophie's captor understood exactly how young minds work and how to exploit their natural adaptability. Consider subscribing if you believe, like I do, that these stories deserve careful attention and respectful storytelling. You'll be part of conversations that treat these cases with the seriousness and humanity they deserve. What made these tapes particularly disturbing was the clinical nature of the interactions. There was no emotion in the man's voice, no indication of personal attachment or sadistic pleasure. This was systematic conditioning being applied with the detachment of a researcher, suggesting someone with either professional training in behavioral psychology or extensive experience in this type of manipulation. The decisions documented on these tapes weren't random acts of cruelty. They were calculated steps in a process designed to completely reconstruct a child's identity. The transformation of the investigation, from missing person case to evidence of sophisticated psychological abuse, required Sheriff Gonzalez to make some difficult decisions about how to present these findings to the public. On February 8, 2024, she stood before a room full of reporters and officially reclassified Sophie's 1994 disappearance as a case of abduction and long-term captivity. The impact of that announcement rippled through Maple Ridge and beyond, as people began to understand that they had been living with a predator in their midst for decades. The revelations shared during that press conference painted a picture of methodical planning that went far beyond anything the community had imagined. The perpetrator had assumed a bus driver identity during the chaos of the strike, using his access to the transportation system to lure children with the appearance of legitimate authority. The mindset required to infiltrate such a trusted system, to exploit the very mechanisms designed to keep children safe, revealed someone who understood institutional vulnerabilities with frightening precision. Sheriff Gonzalez was careful to note that, based on current evidence, Sophie was believed to be the only known victim at this time. However, the careful phrasing of that statement carried an ominous undertone that suggested investigators suspected there might be more cases yet to be discovered. The journey through the evidence had revealed such sophisticated methods that it seemed unlikely this had been a first attempt. The transformation from local investigation to multi-state criminal enterprise began with Detective Sullivan's methodical journey through decades of archived paperwork. There's something almost poetic about how the most sophisticated criminals often leave their most revealing clues in the most mundane places. The decision to dig deeper into those old hiring records from January 1994 would prove to be the breakthrough that cracked this case wide open. What Sullivan discovered hidden in those dusty files was a detail that should have raised immediate red flags 30 years earlier. Among the substitute driver applications was one name that stood out like a beacon: Tommy Lee Davis. Address on file, phone NA, cleared checkbox left blank. But here's what made this entry particularly suspicious. While every other application had been professionally typed on official forms, this one was handwritten in what appeared to be a rushed scrawl, as if someone had added it at the last minute. The mindset behind this deception reveals someone who understood bureaucratic systems well enough to exploit their weaknesses. The impact of adding a handwritten name to a typed list suggests someone with inside knowledge of how these records were maintained. Someone who knew that during the chaos of the strike, proper verification procedures would likely be overlooked. The hidden truth embedded in this simple paperwork manipulation was that they were dealing with someone who had been studying institutional vulnerabilities for quite some time. Cross-referencing the name Tommy Lee Davis through state databases yielded exactly what investigators had begun to fear: absolutely nothing. No driver's license, no registered vehicles, no state identification, no tax records, no social security number. The identity was completely fabricated, created specifically for this operation, and then discarded once it had served its purpose. The revelations that emerged from this discovery forced investigators to confront a disturbing reality. They were dealing with someone who had experience creating and using false identities. But the real breakthrough came when Detective Sullivan began expanding his search beyond Ohio's borders. The journey through national databases of missing children cases revealed a pattern that sent chills through the entire investigative team. In 1987, 7 years before Sophie's disappearance, a child had vanished in Kentucky under remarkably similar circumstances. A man matching the same physical description had been seen driving an unauthorized school bus in the area just days before the disappearance. The transformation of this case from isolated incident to potential serial predation became undeniable when the Kentucky details were examined more closely. Behind the scenes of what local authorities had treated as a random kidnapping was evidence of the same systematic planning, the same exploitation of transportation vulnerabilities, the same careful attention to timing and opportunity. The decisions made in both cases showed an identical pattern of behavior that suggested extensive experience and refinement of technique. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was the realization that if there were 2 cases, there were likely more. The mindset required to operate across state lines, to maintain multiple false identities, to successfully evade detection for decades, speaks to someone with either professional training in clandestine operations or extensive criminal experience spanning years or possibly decades. The impact of this revelation forced investigators to completely reassess everything they thought they knew about Sophie's case. The revelations continued to mount as Sullivan expanded his search parameters, looking for any cases involving missing children and unauthorized school buses across the entire Midwest. The journey through these cold case files was revealing a pattern of predation that had been operating undetected for far longer than anyone had imagined. Each new case brought additional confirmation that Tommy Lee Davis was just one identity among many, and Sophie Martinez was just one victim in what appeared to be a systematic operation. The transformation from multi-state investigation to discovering an actual crime scene happened through one of those unexpected breaks that remind us how human memory can preserve the most crucial details for decades. Helen Price, a retired social worker now living in assisted care, had been following the news coverage of Sophie's case when something clicked in her mind. The journey through her memories brought back a deeply unsettling encounter from 1994 that she had never quite been able to forget. Helen remembered a man who had come into the county office twice, claiming to be homeschooling a niece. He'd given his name as Tom and had all the right paperwork to start the process. But something about his behavior had triggered every professional instinct she'd developed over 3 decades of social work. The mindset required to recognize potential danger in seemingly normal interactions is something that experienced social workers develop through years of seeing how predators operate within legitimate systems. What had bothered Helen most was the man's refusal to complete the required documentation. Every time she'd asked for specific information about the child's educational background or living situation, he'd become evasive, deflecting questions with charm and excuses. But the detail that had haunted her for 30 years was the child herself, a quiet girl who never spoke, never made eye contact, never displayed any of the normal curiosity or restlessness that children typically show in unfamiliar environments. The impact of Helen's testimony led investigators to a property 15 miles west of Maple Ridge, hidden down a narrow gravel road that dead-ended in dense woods. The house didn't exist on any tax records, had no listed utilities, and appeared on no official maps. The hidden truth about this location was that it had been deliberately chosen for its isolation and anonymity, a place where someone could operate without detection or interruption. When investigators finally gained access to the abandoned structure, they discovered what can only be described as a perfectly preserved time capsule from 1994. The revelations inside that house would provide the most concrete evidence yet of Sophie's captivity and the systematic nature of her abuse. Behind the scenes of what appeared to be a simple rural home was a carefully constructed environment designed for one purpose: the complete psychological control of a child. The living room contained a small television positioned on a wooden cart, its VCR tray jammed open as if someone had been in the middle of watching something when they were suddenly interrupted. Canned food lined makeshift shelves, all with expiration dates from the mid-90s, creating an eerie snapshot of a life that had been abruptly abandoned. Most chillingly, newspapers from the week of Sophie's disappearance were stacked beside a recliner, their headlines screaming about the ongoing search for the missing girl. The decisions made in arranging this space revealed someone who had been following the investigation closely, perhaps even taking a perverse satisfaction in monitoring the community's growing desperation. The transformation from predator to observer suggested someone who enjoyed the psychological impact of their actions as much as the crime itself. In the corner of the room, positioned beside a child-sized mattress that was far too small for any adult, sat a space heater and a collection of crayon drawings taped to the wall above it. Those drawings stopped everyone cold. Created in the unmistakable style of a 9-year-old child, they depicted scenes that could only have come from Sophie's own hand. One showed a yellow school bus, with oversized windows and a smiling stick figure holding what was clearly a lunchbox. Above the drawing, in careful child's handwriting, were the words that would haunt investigators for years to come. Tommy takes me to the trees. The journey through this abandoned house was revealing layer after layer of calculated preparation and psychological manipulation. The mindset required to create such a controlled environment, to maintain it for months while following news coverage of the search, speaks to someone with extensive experience in long-term captivity scenarios. The discovery of that reinforced door changed everything about how investigators understood the scope and sophistication of Sophie's captivity. There was no handle, no traditional way to open it from the inside, just a solid barrier that had been deliberately designed to keep someone contained. The transformation from hidden room to actual prison cell became undeniably clear when crime scene investigators finally pried that door open and confronted the reality of what lay behind it. The journey into that sealed chamber was like stepping into a nightmare carefully disguised as a child's bedroom. Pink walls that might have seemed cheerful in any other context took on a sinister quality when you realized they were part of a calculated environment designed to psychologically manipulate a captive child. The collapsed twin bed, children's DVDs scattered on shelves, and expired food containers told the story of long-term habitation under the most controlled circumstances imaginable. But it was the tiny handprints on the walls that truly revealed the hidden truth about Sophie's experience in that room. These weren't random marks made by a bored child. They were desperate attempts at communication, at maintaining some connection to reality and hope. Etched into the painted surface were messages that broke the hearts of every investigator who read them. "I miss outside," carved with what must have been fingernails or makeshift tools, and most devastating of all, day 347, showing that Sophie had been keeping track of her captivity with the methodical precision of someone trying to maintain their sanity in an impossible situation. The mindset required to survive that kind of isolation, while maintaining enough clarity to count the days, speaks to Sophie's incredible resilience, but it also reveals the systematic nature of her psychological torture. The impact of seeing those numbers etched into the wall forced investigators to confront the reality that this hadn't been a short-term kidnapping. This had been nearly a year of carefully controlled captivity designed to completely reshape a child's understanding of reality. The revelations continued when investigators discovered the black binder that would redefine their entire understanding of this operation. Hidden behind a false panel in what appeared to be a closet was documentation that read like a manual for systematic child abuse. Project Blossom, Developmental Conditioning Timeline, was typed across the cover in clinical professional formatting that suggested either academic training or extensive research in behavioral psychology. The decisions documented in that binder revealed a mind that approached child abuse with the detachment of a scientist conducting research. Page after page outlined age thresholds for optimal psychological manipulation, environmental control protocols designed to maximize dependency, isolation techniques calibrated to different personality types, and reinforcement methods that could gradually reshape a child's entire sense of identity. The transformation from random predator to systematic researcher became impossible to deny when faced with such methodical documentation. Behind the scenes of what had appeared to be a simple kidnapping case was evidence of something far more sophisticated and terrifying. The journey through that binder revealed protocols for different phases of conditioning, detailed timelines for breaking down psychological resistance, and, most chillingly, instructions for what the document referred to as identity reconstruction. This wasn't just about holding Sophie captive. This was about completely erasing who she was and rebuilding her into someone else entirely. The hidden truth embedded in Project Blossom was that this wasn't an isolated case of child abuse. The clinical language, the systematic approach, the detailed protocols all suggested someone who had been refining these techniques over multiple victims and multiple years. The impact of this discovery forced law enforcement to completely reassess not just Sophie's case, but potentially dozens of other missing children cases that might be connected to this operation. The transformation from victim to survivor became heartbreakingly clear when investigators discovered Sophie's final video message hidden among the collected evidence. This wasn't another conditioning tape created by her captor. This was Sophie herself, speaking directly to the camera with a clarity and determination that defied everything the Project Blossom protocols had been designed to achieve. The journey from terrified 9-year-old to this older, hollow-eyed but unbroken child revealed an inner strength that had somehow survived nearly 2 years of systematic psychological manipulation. In the video, Sophie appears to be approximately 11 or 12 years old, wearing a winter coat. That's too large for her frame, standing just outside the pink room that had become her prison. Her voice is barely above a whisper, but her words carry the weight of someone who has made a life-or-death decision. My name is Sophie Martinez. I think I've been here for a long time. I think Tommy's sick. I'm going to try to get out. The mindset required to maintain her true identity despite months of conditioning reveals something extraordinary about human resilience: the impact of hearing Sophie reclaim her name, assert her reality, and declare her intention to escape showed that even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation has its limits when confronted with an unbreakable spirit. The hidden truth embedded in this final message was that Sophie had never truly surrendered, had never fully succumbed to the identity reconstruction that Project Blossom had attempted to impose upon her. But the revelations that emerged from this video raised as many questions as they answered. If this was Sophie's final message from the house, what had happened next? The decision she'd made to resist and escape suggested she had succeeded in leaving that pink room behind. But where had she gone? The journey from captive child to missing person took on an entirely new dimension, when investigators realized they might be looking for someone who was still alive. The answer came from an unexpected source that would fundamentally alter the entire timeline of the investigation. Grainy security footage from a gas station in Jefferson County, dated May 19, 2010, showed something that stopped investigators cold. Behind the scenes of what appeared to be a routine transaction was evidence that Sophie's story hadn't ended in that hidden house. The transformation from childhood victim to teenage survivor became undeniably real when facial recognition software confirmed the impossible. The footage showed a man with glasses and a short beard guiding a girl who appeared to be 13 or 14 years old into the gas station. But this wasn't just any teenager. The facial structure, the distinctive eye shape, even the way she moved suggested this was Sophie Martinez, somehow alive and appearing in public 16 years after her disappearance. The impact of this discovery sent shockwaves through the entire investigative team because it meant everything they thought they knew about Sophie's fate had been wrong. What made this footage particularly disturbing was the girl's behavior. She stood unnaturally still while the man purchased supplies, never speaking, never moving independently, displaying the kind of trained compliance that spoke to years of continued conditioning. The mindset required to maintain such complete control over another human being for decades reveals a level of psychological manipulation that goes far beyond typical criminal behavior. But perhaps the most haunting moment in that grainy footage occurred when the girl looked directly at the security camera. Her eyes, hollow and distant, seemed to stare through the lens with an expression that carried the weight of unimaginable experiences. The revelations hidden in that single glance suggested someone who had survived something that should have destroyed her, yet somehow still retained enough awareness to look for help, even in the most controlled circumstances. The transformation from missing child case to confirmed trafficking operation happened through the meticulous science of facial recognition analysis. When forensic specialists ran detailed comparisons between the 2010 gas station footage and Sophie's original missing person photographs, they found matches that defied probability. The iris patterns were identical, the distinctive eyebrow arch unchanged despite years of growth, and the nose shape perfectly consistent with natural aging progression. The hidden truth that investigators had been desperately hoping for was finally confirmed. Sophie Martinez was alive. But this revelation brought with it an even more disturbing discovery that would completely reshape the investigation. The man accompanying Sophie in that 2010 footage wasn't Tommy Lee Davis, the bearded driver who had taken her in 1994. This person was younger, taller, with completely different facial features and body language. The impact of this realization forced investigators to confront a truth they hadn't wanted to consider. They weren't dealing with a single predator operating alone, but rather an organized network of individuals working together in systematic coordination. The mindset required to maintain such an operation across multiple years, multiple handlers, and multiple locations speaks to something far more sophisticated than typical criminal behavior. Behind the scenes of what had appeared to be one man's twisted obsession was emerging evidence of an entire infrastructure designed to traffic and control children through long-term psychological conditioning. The decisions made to transfer Sophie between handlers suggested someone was orchestrating this operation from a position of authority and experience. The revelations that emerged from this discovery prompted immediate federal involvement, because the evidence now pointed to crimes that crossed state lines and involved organized criminal enterprise. Special Agent Michael Torres, a 20-year veteran specializing in human trafficking cases, joined the investigation with resources and expertise that local law enforcement simply couldn't provide. His journey through the evidence revealed patterns that were disturbingly familiar from other trafficking operations he'd encountered across the country. Agent Torres's analysis of Project Blossom documentation revealed something that chilled everyone involved in the case. This wasn't just systematic child abuse. This was a sophisticated conditioning program designed to create compliant victims who could be transferred between handlers without resistance. The transformation from individual predator to organized network meant they were potentially looking at dozens of victims across multiple states and multiple decades. The hidden truth embedded in the Project Blossom protocols was that Sophie had been part of a pilot program, a test case for techniques that would later be refined and applied to other children. The clinical nature of the documentation, the systematic approach to psychological manipulation, the careful tracking of behavioral modifications, all of it pointed to an operation that treated children like products being developed for specific purposes. Behind the scenes of this trafficking network was a level of organization that suggested professional coordination, possibly involving individuals with backgrounds in psychology, education, or law enforcement. The impact of this discovery meant that Sophie's case was no longer about finding one missing child. It was about dismantling an entire criminal enterprise that had been operating undetected for decades. The revelations continued to mount as federal resources were brought to bear on the investigation. Database searches revealed similar cases in neighboring states, all involving children who had disappeared under circumstances that now seemed suspiciously familiar. The mindset required to coordinate such widespread criminal activity across multiple jurisdictions speaks to someone with extensive knowledge of how law enforcement agencies operate and how to exploit gaps in interagency communication. What made this discovery particularly urgent was the realization that if Sophie was still alive in 2010, there was a possibility she might still be alive today. The journey from missing child to potential current victim transformed this from a cold case investigation to an active rescue operation with life-or-death implications. The transformation from theoretical trafficking network to concrete evidence of systematic operation happened through one of those seemingly insignificant discoveries that change everything. Jessica Walsh, the former gas station clerk who had been working that day in 2010, had kept meticulous records of everything from her employment years stored in boxes in her basement. The journey through her archived materials was triggered by news coverage of Sophie's case, and what she found would provide the most direct evidence yet that Sophie had never stopped fighting for her freedom. Hidden among old notebooks and receipts from her 12 years working at that Jefferson County gas station was a piece of paper that had been overlooked for over a decade. On the back of a routine transaction receipt, scratched in barely visible pencil, were words that made Jessica's hands tremble as she read them. "If you read this, my name is Sophie Martinez. Help me. Please." The mindset required to seize that moment of opportunity, to risk everything by leaving that desperate message while under constant surveillance, reveals the extraordinary courage that Sophie had maintained even after years of conditioning. The impact of this discovery went far beyond just confirming Sophie's survival. When handwriting analysts compared the scratched message to samples from Sophie's elementary school years, they found matches that were statistically impossible to fake. The letter formations, the pressure patterns, even the way she dotted her I's remained consistent despite the years of trauma and conditioning. The hidden truth embedded in that desperate plea was that somewhere beneath all the psychological manipulation, the real Sophie Martinez had never been completely erased, but this revelation also confirmed investigators' worst fears about the sophistication of the network controlling her. The decisions made to allow Sophie even that brief moment alone near the counter suggested either overconfidence in their conditioning methods or a level of psychological control so complete that they believed she would never dare to seek help. Behind the scenes of what appeared to be a routine gas station stop was evidence of a trafficking operation so well organized that they could move victims through public spaces without fear of detection. The revelations that emerged from FBI pattern analysis painted a picture that was both staggering in scope and terrifying in its implications. Federal analysts had identified a systematic pattern of missing girls across multiple states between 1998 and 2013, all sharing disturbing similarities that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The transformation from isolated cases to recognized trafficking pattern revealed an operation that had been hiding in plain sight for over 15 years. Each case followed an eerily similar script. Silent teenage girls seen briefly with older men at remote truck stops, generic motels, and gas stations across the Midwest. The behavioral profiles were consistently identical. Girls who displayed an unnatural stillness, never spoke unless directly prompted, showed no signs of normal teenage independence or curiosity. The impact of recognizing this pattern meant that potentially dozens of families had been living with the same devastating uncertainty that Carol Martinez had endured for 30 years. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was the systematic nature of the financial transactions. Every interaction was paid for in cash by men using obviously fake names, with prepaid cards that couldn't be traced back to any legitimate source. The mindset required to maintain such operational security across multiple handlers and multiple years speaks to someone with extensive experience in evading law enforcement detection. The journey through these transaction records revealed a network that understood exactly how to exploit gaps in interagency communication and jurisdictional limitations. The revelations continued to mount as analysts dug deeper into the pattern. These weren't random predators operating independently. This was a coordinated network with established protocols, predetermined routes, and systematic methods for moving victims across state lines without triggering automatic alerts. Behind the scenes of what local law enforcement had treated as isolated missing person cases was evidence of the most sophisticated trafficking operation that federal investigators had ever encountered. The transformation from theoretical multiple victims to concrete proof came through another one of those overlooked pieces of evidence that had been sitting in plain sight for years. A gray 1996 Dodge van, registered under the fake name Martin Foster, had been impounded in Kenosha County after sitting abandoned in a Walmart parking lot for 3 years. The journey through its contents would reveal the true scope of this trafficking network and provide heartbreaking confirmation that Sophie was far from the only child whose life had been destroyed by this operation. Inside that van, investigators found the remnants of what could only be described as a mobile prison. 14 empty water bottles scattered throughout the cargo area told the story of long-distance transport under the most controlled conditions imaginable. A stained mattress pad spoke to forced overnight stays, while a broken GPS device suggested systematic travel along predetermined routes. The mindset required to maintain such a mobile operation reveals someone with extensive experience in moving human cargo without detection or discovery. But the most devastating piece of evidence was tucked into the glove compartment, a Polaroid photograph of a young girl, maybe 12 years old, with different hair and features than Sophie, but wearing that same expression of trained compliance that had become horrifyingly familiar. On the back, written in the same precise handwriting found in Project Blossom documentation, was a single word: Casey, 2004. The impact of this discovery meant they were looking at evidence of systematic victimization spanning at least a decade, with each child becoming another entry in what appeared to be a carefully maintained catalog. The revelations that emerged from this van evidence forced investigators to confront the reality that they weren't just dealing with Sophie's case, but potentially dozens of similar situations. Behind the scenes of what appeared to be a single trafficking operation was emerging proof of a network that had been collecting, conditioning, and transporting children across multiple states for years. The decisions made to document each victim with photographs suggest someone who viewed these children not as human beings, but as inventory in a systematic criminal enterprise. The breakthrough that would lead investigators to their most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. Hidden among the van's contents was a torn map fragment with handwritten notations that had been overlooked during the initial evidence processing. The map showed rural Minnesota, with a location circled in red ink and marked Drop Site B. The transformation from random evidence to actionable intelligence happened when analysts realized this might be indicating an active facility rather than just a historical location. Satellite imagery of the coordinates revealed an abandoned grain storage facility in Stillwater, Minnesota, officially closed since 1997, but showing signs of recent activity that made no sense for a supposedly derelict property. The hidden truth embedded in those satellite photos was immediately apparent to experienced investigators. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel, patterns too neat and recent to be from casual trespassers or vandals. Someone had been using this location regularly and recently. The impact of this discovery transformed the entire investigation from historical cold case to potential active rescue scenario. The journey through decades of archived evidence had led them to what might be a currently operational facility, which meant that somewhere in that compound, victims could still be alive, still waiting for rescue. The mindset required to operate such a remote facility for decades without detection speaks to someone with extensive knowledge of how to exploit jurisdictional gaps and avoid routine law enforcement patrols. Federal teams immediately began planning tactical operations while analyzing every detail of the satellite imagery. The revelations emerging from their analysis painted a picture of a facility that had been deliberately chosen for its isolation and defensibility. Surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a single road, with no neighboring properties or regular traffic patterns, it was the perfect location for someone who needed to operate without observation or interference. The transformation from 30-year mystery to active rescue mission reached its climax on February 24, 2024, when FBI tactical teams finally breached that abandoned grain facility in Stillwater, Minnesota. The journey through those rusty corridors, past equipment that had been sitting dormant for decades, led investigators to a makeshift room where they found what they had been searching for: a young woman curled up in the corner wearing unicorn pajamas and an oversized hoodie that seemed to swallow her thin frame. The impact of that first moment of contact cannot be overstated. After 3 decades of searching, following leads that had gone cold countless times, after watching Carol Martinez age with grief and uncertainty, investigators were finally face-to-face with Sophie Martinez herself. The mindset required to process this reality, that a 9-year-old girl had somehow survived 30 years of captivity, challenged everything anyone thought they knew about human resilience and the capacity for survival under impossible circumstances. When agents asked her name, her response revealed the extraordinary strength that had carried her through 3 decades of psychological manipulation. She whispered, "Sophie," and then, with more clarity, "Sophie Martinez." The hidden truth embedded in that moment was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire case. Despite everything she had endured, despite years of conditioning designed to erase her identity, the real Sophie had never been completely destroyed. Behind the scenes of systematic abuse and manipulation, some core part of her had remained intact, waiting for this moment of rescue. The revelations that emerged during Sophie's initial medical evaluation painted a picture of survival that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. At age 15, she showed signs of mild dehydration and malnourishment. Her skin pale from years of limited sunlight, her limbs thin from inadequate nutrition. But remarkably, there were no visible signs of recent physical trauma. The decisions made by her captors had focused on psychological control rather than physical violence, which explained how she had managed to survive for so long. The journey through Sophie's psychological assessment revealed the true scope of what she had endured. She spoke in fragments, her communication patterns showing the impact of years of conditioning designed to limit her ability to express herself freely. When she mentioned, "Tommy said I was his star," investigators understood they were hearing the voice of someone who had been systematically programmed to view her captivity through the lens her abusers had created. The transformation from normal child development to this carefully controlled psychological state represented one of the most sophisticated examples of long-term behavioral conditioning that experts had ever encountered. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came when Sophie referred to other girls in videos who had passed their tests already. The impact of this statement forced investigators to confront the reality that Sophie's rescue was just the beginning of uncovering a network that had been operating with multiple victims across multiple decades. The mindset required to create such a systematic operation, to maintain multiple victims simultaneously, speaks to a level of criminal organization that challenges conventional understanding of how trafficking networks operate. Behind the scenes of Sophie's rescue was the beginning of a much larger investigation into what appeared to be the most sophisticated child trafficking and conditioning operation in modern criminal history. The revelations emerging from her debriefing sessions would provide law enforcement with their first real insight into how this network had managed to operate undetected for so long, and, more importantly, how many other victims might still be out there waiting for rescue. The transformation from 30 years of devastating uncertainty to the moment of reunion is something that human language struggles to capture adequately. Carol Martinez stood on her front porch that evening, watching an unmarked SUV navigate the snowy driveway toward her house. The journey from that February morning in 1994, when she'd watched Sophie walk to the bus stop, to this moment had aged her in ways that went far beyond simple chronology. The mindset required to maintain hope across 3 decades of silence speaks to a mother's love that transcends rational expectation. When the SUV door opened and Sophie stepped out, the impact of seeing her daughter alive hit Carol with a force that nearly buckled her knees. Sophie appeared smaller than in the news photos, but there was something in her eyes that spoke to experiences no 15-year-old should ever have endured. The hidden truth of their separation became painfully clear in that moment. They were both strangers to each other now, connected by blood and love, but separated by 30 years of completely different realities. "Mom?" Sophie asked, her voice carrying the weight of uncertainty and hope. That single word broke through every psychological barrier that Carol had built to protect herself from the possibility of false hope. The revelations contained in that tentative question revealed that despite everything Sophie had endured, despite all the conditioning and manipulation, she had somehow retained the memory of what home looked like and who her mother was. They met halfway in the snow, collapsing into each other with an emotion that was both joyous and heartbreaking. Behind the scenes of this reunion was the complex reality that both women had been fundamentally changed by their experiences. The decisions they would need to make going forward would require rebuilding a relationship from scratch while navigating the psychological aftermath of trauma that neither of them fully understood yet. The journey toward healing began at a specialized trauma recovery center, where Sophie would learn to navigate a world that had become foreign to her after decades of captivity. The simple act of sleeping in a real bed presented challenges that most people could never imagine. Sophie hadn't experienced the comfort and security of proper bedding for over 2,800 nights, and the transformation from survival mode to safety required psychological adjustments that would take months or possibly years to complete. The impact of long-term captivity revealed itself in countless small ways that broke the hearts of everyone working with Sophie. She flinched when lights were turned off, having been conditioned to associate darkness with punishment or isolation. The sound of doors opening caused her to startle, her body automatically preparing for whatever might come next. Perhaps most poignantly, when she saw her reflection in a mirror for the first time in years, she whispered, "She looks like me, but older," as if she was meeting a stranger who happened to share her face. The mindset required to readjust to freedom after such. Extended captivity involves relearning the most basic assumptions about human interaction and personal safety. Behind the scenes of Sophie's recovery was a team of specialists who understood that her journey back to normalcy would be measured in small victories rather than dramatic breakthroughs. The revelations emerging from her therapy sessions would provide crucial insights not just into her own healing process, but into the methods used by her captors to maintain control over multiple victims across multiple years. The hidden truth about Sophie's recovery was that it wasn't just about healing from trauma. It was about discovering who she might have become if her childhood hadn't been stolen from her. The transformation from victim to survivor to someone rebuilding their identity from scratch represented one of the most complex psychological rehabilitation cases that experts had ever encountered. The transformation from individual survivor to witness of systematic atrocity became heartbreakingly clear during Sophie's therapy sessions when she began speaking about the other girls she had encountered during her captivity. The journey through her fragmented memories revealed a truth that investigators had feared but hoped against. Sophie hadn't been alone in her suffering. The mindset required to process what she was telling them challenged every assumption about the scope and duration of this criminal network. "Casey, Beth, Kelly," Sophie whispered during one particularly difficult session. "They were just like me, except they never made it home. They failed because they talked too much or asked about outside. He said they weren't ready. The impact of those words hit the therapy room like a physical blow, because Sophie wasn't just recounting names. She was providing testimony about other children who had been murdered for the crime of maintaining hope or curiosity about the world beyond their captivity. The revelations embedded in Sophie's testimony painted a picture of a conditioning system so ruthless that failure to comply completely resulted in elimination. Behind the scenes of what had appeared to be psychological manipulation was evidence of a network that treated children as disposable commodities, discarding those who couldn't be completely broken and reshaped according to their specifications. The decisions made to preserve Sophie while eliminating others suggested she had displayed exactly the kind of compliance that the Project Blossom protocols had been designed to achieve. The hidden truth that emerged from these sessions was that Sophie had been forced to witness the consequences of resistance, creating a psychological environment where survival meant complete submission. The transformation from innocent child to traumatized witness had been carefully orchestrated to ensure maximum compliance from remaining victims. Each name she mentioned represented not just another life lost, but another lesson in the cost of defiance that had been burned into her memory. But Sophie's testimony also provided investigators with their first concrete leads about the broader scope of this operation. The journey through her recollections revealed details about different locations, different handlers, and different victims that painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise spanning multiple states and multiple years. The mindset required to coordinate such widespread activity while maintaining operational security spoke to someone with extensive experience in evading law enforcement detection. The revelations that emerged from Sophie's debriefing sessions triggered a nationwide search for additional evidence that had been overlooked or misclassified in local jurisdictions. An archivist in Des Moines, working through misplaced evidence boxes, discovered materials that would confirm Sophie's testimony about the ongoing nature of this operation. VHS tapes and photographs that had been misfiled for over a decade suddenly took on new significance when viewed through the lens of Project Blossom documentation. One photograph in particular stopped investigators cold. Another young girl standing beside a van, with a county fair billboard clearly visible in the background reading July 2009. The impact of this discovery meant the network had been actively operating at least 15 years after Sophie's initial abduction, continuing to collect and condition new victims long after law enforcement had assumed the case had gone cold. Behind the scenes of what appeared to be routine archival work was emerging proof that this criminal enterprise had been far more active and successful than anyone had dared to imagine. The girl in the photograph, who investigators would later identify through missing person databases as Maya, appeared in conditioning videos that followed the exact same protocols documented in Project Blossom materials. The transformation from individual case to systematic operation became undeniable when faced with such clear evidence of methodology being replicated across different victims and different time periods. The transformation from rescue operation to full-scale criminal network dismantlement reached a critical turning point when federal investigators traced financial records from the trafficking operation to an unexpected location. A warehouse in Joliet, Illinois had been operating as a distribution center for what they euphemistically called educational media, using coded language that allowed buyers to request specific types of conditioning videos without explicitly stating their criminal intent. The journey through intercepted communications revealed phrases like Blossom Line cassettes and developmental programming that masked the horrific reality of what was being traded. The impact of the warehouse raid sent shockwaves through law enforcement because of who they found among the buyers. 11 men were arrested, but their backgrounds revealed the most disturbing aspect of this entire operation. These weren't shadowy figures operating on society's margins. The mindset required to maintain such a network had infiltrated the very institutions designed to protect children. Among those arrested were licensed teachers, a school administrator, and, most chillingly, a foster parent who had been providing homes for vulnerable children while simultaneously participating in their exploitation. Behind the scenes of this, Distribution network was a level of organization that suggested professional coordination spanning years or possibly decades. The revelations emerging from seized computers and financial records painted a picture of systematic commerce in child abuse, with buyers paying premium prices for specific types of conditioning content. The decisions made to categorize and market these materials like any other product revealed a level of psychological detachment that experts struggled to comprehend. But the hidden truth about this warehouse operation was that it represented only one node in a much larger network. The transformation from local investigation to national criminal enterprise became undeniable when analysts realized the distribution patterns extended across multiple states and potentially involved dozens of additional participants who had yet to be identified. The journey through these transaction records revealed purchasing patterns that suggested some buyers had been customers for years, creating a sustained market for the systematic abuse of children. The revelations continued to mount as investigators worked through the seized evidence, but their sense of progress was shattered on March 17, 2024, when an encrypted email arrived that changed everything about their understanding of the current threat level. The subject line alone sent chills through the investigative team. "Sophie wasn't yours to save." The impact of those words was immediate and terrifying, because it meant someone connected to the original network was monitoring their investigation and felt confident enough to make direct contact. The message contained a single attachment that stopped everyone cold, a still frame showing Sophie sleeping in the still water room, but with a timestamp that defied everything they thought they knew about the timeline. August 4, 2020. The mindset required to process this revelation forced investigators to confront a disturbing reality: whoever had orchestrated. Sophie's original abduction had returned to watch her during her captivity, just 4 years ago, and had documented that visit with the kind of calculated precision that characterized every aspect of this operation. Behind the scenes of what had appeared to be a cold case investigation was emerging proof that the primary perpetrator was still active, still hunting, and still maintaining surveillance capabilities that allowed him to monitor both his victims and the law enforcement efforts to find them. The decisions made to send that message weren't driven by panic or desperation. They were calculated psychological warfare designed to demonstrate that despite all their progress, investigators were still being watched and manipulated by someone who remained several steps ahead of them. The transformation from victim to advocate represents perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Sophie's entire journey. Today, the man known as Tommy Lee Davis, whose real name investigators believe to be Edward Peterson, remains one of America's most wanted fugitives. The mindset required to evade capture for over 30 years while operating such a sophisticated criminal network speaks to someone with extensive training in counter-surveillance and operational security. Behind the scenes of this ongoing manhunt, federal agencies continue to pursue leads across multiple states, but Peterson's ability to maintain multiple identities and exploit institutional vulnerabilities has kept him several steps ahead of law enforcement. Sophie's current life represents a study in resilience that defies everything experts thought they knew about recovery from long-term trauma. Living in protective relocation, she has embraced art therapy as a means of processing experiences that most people cannot even imagine. The journey through her healing process has revealed an extraordinary coping mechanism. She draws pictures of the other girls she knew during captivity, but not as they were in their suffering. Instead, she recreates them as they should have been, playing in parks, attending school, celebrating birthdays, living the childhood experiences that were stolen from them. The impact of Sophie's artistic expression goes far beyond personal therapy. Her drawings have become a form of memorial for children whose names may never be known, whose families may never learn what happened to them. The decisions she makes in each sketch represent an act of reclamation, refusing to let those girls be remembered only as victims. The hidden truth embedded in her art is that she's rewriting their stories, giving them the dignity and joy that their captors tried to erase. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Sophie's recovery has been her transformation from someone who was silenced for decades to someone who now speaks with remarkable clarity about her experiences. The revelations that emerged from her final statement to investigators would become a rallying cry for survivors everywhere. If someone promises you safety but takes your name, your words, your light, that isn't safety. That's a cage. Her words carry the weight of 3 decades of understanding about the nature of control and manipulation. The mindset required to articulate such insights after everything she endured reveals someone who has not just survived, but has transformed their trauma into wisdom that could help protect other children. Behind the scenes of her recovery is a young woman who refuses to be defined by what was done to her. The journey through Sophie's statement continues with words that reframe the entire narrative of her abduction. "I didn't get on the wrong bus. He drove the wrong one on purpose." That simple correction carries profound implications about how we understand predatory behavior and victim responsibility. The impact of that statement forces us to confront our tendency to focus on what victims could have done differently rather than acknowledging the calculated nature of predatory planning. Her final declaration represents the ultimate transformation from victim to survivor. "I'm not a victim anymore." Those words don't erase what happened or minimize the ongoing investigation, but they establish Sophie's agency in defining her own identity moving forward. The revelations embedded in that statement challenge every assumption about how trauma survivors should speak about their experiences. Sophie's story reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to survive, resist, and ultimately transform trauma into purpose. Her journey from that snowy February morning in 1994 to her powerful voice today represents something extraordinary about resilience and hope that deserves to be shared and remembered. If you've stayed with me through this entire investigation, you understand that true crime isn't just about the crimes themselves. It's about the people who refuse to give up, the investigators who never stop searching, and the survivors who find the courage to speak their truth. These stories matter because they show us both the worst and the best of what humans are capable of. I create content like this because I believe these voices need to be heard, these cases need to be understood, and these lessons need to be learned. If you found value in Sophie's story and want to join me as I continue exploring cases that reveal the complexity of justice, survival, and human determination, I'd love to have you subscribe to the channel. You'll be part of a community that believes these stories deserve careful, respectful attention. If you made it all the way to the end of Sophie's incredible journey with me, leave a comment saying, "Sophie's voice matters." It helps me understand that these longer, more detailed investigations resonate with viewers who appreciate the full scope of these complex cases. And if this story moved you the way it moved me while researching and presenting it, really does help other people discover these important narratives. There's a video right here that explores another case where the truth remained hidden for decades before finally coming to light. The connections between cases like these often reveal patterns that help us understand how justice can prevail, even when it seems impossible. Click and continue with me over there. I think you'll find the parallels fascinating and the outcome equally compelling.